Because one of the most popular videos on my channel was about reading difficult books, I end up getting asked in the comment sections quite often about how I read and what techniques I use in order to read better, to read more carefully. When it comes to advice generally, there's always a risk of simplifying too much, putting into words the bulk of one's experiences in a kind of succinct manner that can deliver sometimes false confidence to the person receiving the message. It delivers this sense of, oh, look, if you just follow these steps, you will accomplish the very same effect. When it comes to giving advice about reading, that seems especially challenging because so much of the choices that I make and why I read the way that I do is born of my own predisposition, my own experiences, and the context of the reading at the time. And so any advice that I would give about reading is sacrificing all of the myriad necessary caveats that should be carried as addendums with that advice. Any confidence that that advice brings is a kind of false confidence on the basis of the simplicity of the saying of the advice. By speaking it, we are simplifying it into words, and we give it this kind of confidence of being confined within the language that we're using. And that can sometimes mislead and cause people to be more confident about the worth of that advice than they otherwise should be. This is sort of a challenge that applies to all teaching generally. The teacher who's attempting to teach on any one subject has a lifetime of experience behind that thing that they're teaching. And the learner, as opposed to learning through that same experience, that same curiosity and drive and motivation born of specific circumstances, that learner is instead just rotely memorizing the lessons. And that's a pretty different way to learn something. So I think about that whenever I have to give advice. I think about, well, so much of what I would want to give advice about, so much of the advice that I would want to give is so particular to my experiences and my disposition. And I don't want to mislead by giving advice and then having the idea that, oh, it's just a series of rules that you can follow and then you will get the same exact payoff. I think it's so much dependent on you and who you are. I do want to give advice about reading, if only because I find reading for myself so valuable in my own life. And if there's anything that I can say to help someone else discover that same level of value, if someone else is being challenged by all the myriad distractions that are constantly loudly imposing themselves upon our attention, then I want to help that person divvy up that attention more carefully and discover the merits of reading for long extended stretches of time, and especially the merits of reading seriously. And that's what I hope this video can offer. Now, one way to balance out the limitations of advice in order to counteract the simplicity of advice, this video is being done in collaboration with another booktuber, a fantastic booktuber, Prose and Petticoats. She is a reader/writer who chronicles her experiences through various classic literary works, such as by Leo Tolstoy and Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, Charles Dickens. And with each of these broadly classic works, she doesn't just describe her experiences through those works with all of her careful note-taking. She also tries to convey some of the background behind a lot of these works, some of the things that you must know as a reader. And so in many ways, her videos are hugely helpful, almost like a helpful guide. It's nice that we have this booktuber who, through her high production values and the extensive quality of her analysis and thinking, we get someone who's learning her way through the literary canon while also trying to teach the viewer at the same time. And that is Prose and Petticoats. What we're doing with this video is I'm going to be giving my advice in my own way in response to 8 questions, and she's going to be giving her advice in her own way, her own separate way of looking at literature. We're going to call this the Read Smart tag. Anyone can participate and respond to these same questions, but the essence of these questions is to try to learn about how you read, what it is that you've gleaned from your experiences and how the lessons of your own choices in reading can be lessons useful to everyone. Hopefully, there's a lot that you can gain by the differences in our responses, and you get to discern for yourself what seemingly matters about reading to you, and maybe the way in which Emily from Prose and Petticoats reads is more conducive to your own reading, or maybe the way that I like to read matches your own personal inclinations. And that could be something that is useful to just kind of see that golden mean in the middle. Perhaps it can increase your practice of reading in a more nuanced way than otherwise would have been. So this is going to be the Read Smart tag, 8 questions all about how to take reading seriously, how to read more carefully. The very first question is, what is your strategy to stay focused and engaged while reading? Well, the key word there is focus. With all of the distractions that we have on offer to us daily, from the internet, from television, from our phones especially, there is a constant set of temptations that are pulling us away from focused attention. And as soon as we start giving in to those temptations, it becomes like an addiction, specifically a gambling addiction, where there is this dopamine high of anticipation in which it doesn't become about the activity that we're doing itself. It becomes about that activity in a long line of potential activities, and it's just about us looking forward to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. It becomes very hard to just enjoy something for its own sake once you begin feeding that part of yourself, that part that just seeks attention and stimulus. Reading itself is very quiet and often boring. It's that quietness that can sometimes be uncomfortable to deal with because you have to be entirely self-motivated every step of the way. The book itself is not constantly yelling at you or constantly vying for your attention. In fact, in some ways, books can resist you. They can push back on your attention by forcing you to have to work especially hard in order to comprehend them. And that kind of work is one that must be entirely voluntary. The book is not going to drag you along through that experience. It is so much easier to put down a book than it is to pick it up. It is so much easier to just passively consume something than to actively engage with it. So in order to counteract that challenge of focus, that feeling of how much easier it is to focus on something else than it is to focus on a book, I try to make sure that reading is one of the very first things that I do. It often is the first thing that I do as soon as I wake up in the morning. When I go to bed at night, I put my phone many, many feet away from me. It's totally across the room so that I can't just move my arm out to the side and grab it in a moment's notice. I would have to actually get up and walk over. But what is next to me is my Kindle and a book. And the idea is, as soon as the morning starts, as soon as the sun comes through the curtains of my bedroom, I have access to a book and I can just start reading it immediately. And it's putting my headspace into that realm of concentration, of not just having something delivered to me, of me having to work my way forward into something. And I think that's a strong headspace to start the day with. And it's the kind of headspace of allowing quiet to be comforting, as opposed to starting off like 120 miles per hour, just rushing through stimulus. It starts me off at a much calmer pace, but there is still something stimulating about that focus. And it's a reminder of the value in literature. Books don't speak up for themselves very much. They tend to just kind of sit on the wall and wait for you always. And it's that waiting that makes it so that you have to oblige yourself to actually go out of your way to appreciate them. And if you start every day with this notion of, I'm going to remind myself what's so great about books, it really does work as far as, at least for me, reminding me why books have so much value in comparison to other forms of leisure. I obviously play video games, I watch TV, I watch movies, I watch YouTube. I do all of these things that consume our attention. But there is nothing like reading a great book. And I have that point of comparison of all of these memories of having read really fantastic books and had those books fundamentally shift my way of thinking. And it's a shift in such a way that unfortunately I don't think other mediums quite accomplish, or at least I haven't had that experience with other mediums, except maybe music. I think music certainly can have that effect, at least for me. And because books are uninviting in their silence, it becomes necessary to seek them out yourself, as opposed to waiting for them to come to you. All of these other forms of entertainment are so desperate for your attention in ways that books aren't. And so I start the day by reading to put myself back into that headspace as early as possible. And what I've found for myself is it makes the other forms of entertainment feel quite a bit cheaper, quite a bit less gratifying. But I wouldn't recognize that distance in satisfaction if I didn't start with reading first. And so the first tip that I have, if you want to focus more on your reading, is to make reading be the first thing that you do, even if it's just a few minutes in the day, just to make sure that it's fresh in your mind, the value of text in comparison to all of those other leisure activities vying for your attention. Another tip for focus and engagement, and I think this one is equally, if not more important, is to consider writing in your book, or at least writing alongside what it is that you're reading. I think the importance of writing carefully as you read is to try to make markers for yourself of what matters to you. And not just what matters to you, but to actually force you to think carefully about the choices being made by the author as they wrote each book. This is a point that Prose and Petticoats makes in her recent video on being an author, where she talks about reading books like a writer. And it's such valuable advice, I think, because it reminds you of the craft of writing, of the ways that what it is that you're reading has been organized and broken down in such specific ways. The idea is you want to make sure that you're not being too passive with your engagement with literature or nonfiction. You want to be thinking about all of the various choices that go into the craft of what it is that you're reading, the ways that the author is taking their jumbled, mixed up abstractions of thoughts and attempting to make them concrete, often in an organized fashion, often in a momentous fashion of kind of moving from point to point to point. And it's that movement between points that by writing in your books or by writing alongside what you read, you can begin to notice that momentum. So much of writing anything is actually discovering the momentum within the text itself. As you put down words, as you set the tone for a scene, you start to discover implied directions that writing can go. And if you as a reader are thinking as you're reading about the choices that the writer is making, then you start to notice the ebb and flow, the musicality of language and text. And it's that added layer of feeling on top of what it is that you're reading, not just the strict literal meaning of word by word, but the overarching waves of tone and feeling that is within text. That is the thing that you begin to latch onto if you write as you read your literature. If you actively tell yourself, what is this decision that's being made, and why? Why go in this direction? Why use this metaphor? Why build up this character in this particular way? What is with the particular choices in that description? What does that change about how I feel about what it is that I'm reading? What would have been different if it were otherwise? What if the author had chosen to devote their attention to something else? What are these choices of attention that the author is making? It's those kinds of questions that I think add so much to one's engagement with literature. It's a kind of partnership that you have with the author to think through their choices with them and to begin to wonder just as much as they wondered about these ideas. So much of what compels an author to write anything is a mysterious impetus, a kind of intuition about something. And you as a reader, you can latch onto that same intuition and begin to delve into the same questions that the author delves into. And it becomes less about you sitting there listening to what the author has to say and more about you having a conversation with the author. And so that's where writing in a book or writing alongside reading really comes in handy. It makes the work far more active and far less passive. And then the last piece of advice about focus and engagement that I have is try to understand your boredom. How much of your boredom is a matter of lack in terms of the stimulus that you're used to? How much of your boredom is merely because you've essentially become addicted to a certain kind of attention? And if you find yourself constantly distracted as you read, where as you're going through the paragraphs, they sort of drift off into a fog of meaning, then perhaps what's occurring is your mind is divvying up its attention in anticipation of all sorts of other things. And then how did your mind get to that point? What is it about the devotion of your time that makes it so that distraction is so deeply tempting as opposed to focus? And if it's hard for you to focus, if you cannot put yourself in a state of focus, is that who you want yourself to be? Do you want to have this feeling of not having one tool at your disposal, that tool of deep concentration? And if you want to be able to deeply concentrate, then you have to make it a kind of devotion for yourself. One thing about all of this advice about reading to keep in mind is it's not something you have to do. It's really a choice of a kind of lifestyle you want to have. You know, if you asked, how do I live a deeply peaceful life? Perhaps the answer would be live like a yogi mystic somewhere. Become a Buddhist and meditate day in and day out. And then you think, well, wait, so your answer is just to sit all day long and do nothing? And perhaps that is the answer. And maybe it's just not the life that you want. Maybe this life of reading is not one for you, and that's okay. But if you want to make reading serious for yourself, like deeply serious, where you're going to read every single day and be consistent about it, then it's going to require sacrifices of your attention away from other more tempting things, away from things that are much easier to do. And that's a choice that you have to make, and I can't make it for you. But the first step to that choice is understand why you are bored in the first place and what that means to you. What is it about the kind of spaciousness of quiet that disturbs you? And then think, do you want to be disturbed by that, or do you want to overcome that challenge and have a new tool at your disposal, a tool of concentration? The second question is, how does your environment influence your focus, and what can you do to optimize it? Well, one of the first things is, as best as you can, try to find a space without interruption. And what that means is you're probably going to have to get rid of your smartphone, put it far away from you. And then if you're going to move your smartphone away from you and you're going to turn off notifications from your smartphone, which is just constant interruption, then you need another source of additional information as you're reading. Because there's a lot of stuff that you will discover as you read that you don't know and you still need to understand. And the temptation would be to just go online and find the answer. But of course, then you are opening yourself up to more and more distraction. So my advice in that regard, in order to avoid distraction while reading, is to have some reference books beside you. I made a video on this topic of the list of my favorite reference books, but in general, you should have a dictionary right next to you. You should have a thesaurus. You should have some kind of encyclopedia related to the material that you're going to cover. So if you're reading a philosophy book, you should have a resource about philosophy terms so that you could just look that up quickly and not have to worry about becoming distracted by the internet. And all of that is just to reinforce this idea that when you sit down to read, you don't want to have your attention pulled away from you. You don't want to have the addiction of temptation constantly distracting you from the devotion of word. It's an active choice to segment the space of your reading to be its own kind of readerly space. And in line with that, my second piece of advice in this regard is to actually have a reading space. You're watching me now sitting in my reading chair, and right beside me there are reference books in a little shelf. And this is the exact space that I read. And I have all of the books behind me and I can grab them whenever I want them. There's a kind of convenience to that. And I only use this space to read. Aside from recording these videos, this is only used when I sit down on this chair. I'm gonna read. I do not sit down in this chair and just stare at my phone for hours at a time. I do not sit down on this chair and watch movies or do anything else or play games or something. This is my reading chair. And it kind of creates this bodily association with this spot as being a spot of deeper concentration, of me actually trying to get into that literary mode and appreciate it for what it is. So that's why I think it's important to try and designate a space as best as you can. And maybe that space is not in your home. Maybe you go outside, and then it becomes like this meditative process where every time you walk out, it is like a Pavlovian response of this is when I'm now going to read. And maybe that's what you need. But whatever it takes to get away from distraction, I highly recommend that you aim for that. The next question is, what methods do you use to retain and recall information from what you've read? This is a really important question. For the longest time, I was reading very carefully, I was writing, I was trying to stay focused, but I noticed that I wasn't retaining as much information as I would like. What I soon realized is I was essentially becoming familiar with a lot of information, but I wasn't able to pull that information from memory in a way that is actively useful. And that was a pretty difficult challenge for me for a really long time. One of the simplest solutions that I've discovered, at least for myself, is to make sure that as I'm reading, I'm not just familiarizing myself with the information, and I'm not just understanding the information or jotting it down on a sheet of paper, because I think jotting it down is really only transferring that information. It's not really utilizing it. I think what's important is that I actively turn it into a part of my life. Now, some of that requires that you're reading things that actually matter to you, that you're not just reading things that other people are suggesting and you're only reading it out of a kind of peer pressure. What becomes necessary is to really be active about the choices of what you're reading and thinking to yourself, okay, why do I want to read this? Why does it matter to me personally? And once you figure out why it matters to you, then start talking about it. Make it a normal part of your conversations. Have friends or have people that you can talk to about what it is that you read, people who are curious like you. Try to discover those around you who might have something to say in response to what you're reading, and just try to talk about it. Now, the importance of talking about something is anytime that you're talking, there's a pressure of time, right? It just distills it down to what you actively know, what actually can come to the forefront of your thinking. And you very quickly discover what you're uncomfortable thinking about or talking about. As you're talking about something, you immediately will notice the gaps in your knowledge. And it's as quick a form of discovering the gaps of what you think as I think anything else could be. And so it's important that you actively are constantly trying to talk about what you're learning so that you can see those gaps, and then you can go back to your books, and any areas that you can't communicate quickly and easily, those are things that you don't fully understand. So go back to the book. Go back to the book, see your notes. Hopefully you took careful notes in your book. That is something that we'll talk about later with annotation. But go back to your book, look at your notes, and try to refill in those gaps in your speech, and then go back and try and talk about it again. And if you don't have someone who you can easily talk to about literature, or who you can easily talk to about the ideas in the nonfiction books that you're reading, maybe literally just stand up and talk to yourself and just put yourself in that pressure cooker of needing to speak off the cuff extemporaneously on a subject and feel your way through your knowledge of that subject. That's if you really, really want to learn that material. That, I think, is one of the best ways to do so. I've been working as a teacher, as an English teacher, for about 8 years now, and I do think genuinely that the best way to learn something is to teach it. And so if you don't get access to a classroom and you don't get access to attentive listeners, then I think you should go out of your way to just, after you read a chapter of a book, stand up. It might be kind of awkward at first, and just start talking about it to yourself and see how it goes. See how it feels to vocalize what has otherwise been so silent in your mind, and just see what you're missing in that process. That is honestly the best advice that I've found. Teach what it is that you're learning so that you can actually check what you're learning, and it's not just an illusion of understanding that you have. Okay, the next question is, how do you approach difficult or challenging material? I think the biggest lesson that I've learned in this regard is to not let your expectations get ahead of the meaning. Sometimes when we're attempting to read something, we have all of these assumptions about where it's headed. And some of the most difficult literature I've read is the sort of literature that upends expectations often, that is actually trying to show you something complicated that isn't intuitive. And it's that counterintuitiveness that requires you to stop trying to fill in the gaps prematurely. You have to go into a work with the idea that it might have something to teach you. You might have something to learn from it. And that requires a certain open-mindedness to what you're reading. In one sense, it starts to feel like reading a really good, difficult work, a really good, challenging work is like a jigsaw puzzle where you're getting the little pieces of the jigsaw one spot at a time. And there are so many gaps in your understanding, and you have to embrace those gaps and just let them be there. Don't prematurely fill them in with too much inferential assumption. You want to just instead let it kind of fill in, and you can start thinking, okay, does this piece fit with this? Maybe it does. Have multiple interpretations in mind at any one time, and only fill it in as the facts come to register. It's one of those things where there's a kind of patience required with a lot of the more difficult works, because these authors are trying to dole out information in a far more extended way. And some of that is because there is something to learn in that relationship between ideas. It's not enough just to dole out ideas back to back to back. In some philosophy works, for instance, if you read like classic philosophers like Immanuel Kant or David Hume or Spinoza, these highly organized thinkers, part of that organization is the relationship from one idea to the next. There is a syllogism at play very often where it's building from premise to premise to premise to premise. And so you can't really grasp the endpoint until you grasp the relations between those premises, the kind of logic between those premises. And that requires you not filling in too much, not just assuming, oh, I know this thing is coming up ahead. Because if they're genuinely trying to show you something counterintuitive, it's not going to be one of those things that you can just guess. Presume that maybe they actually really did think through what it is that they're writing down in such a way that their thoughts led in unexpected directions, and allow yourself to embrace the unexpected. In line with that, it's also really important to not be too concerned about knowing everything. Some books, like I think of James Joyce's Ulysses, is a puzzle box of concepts and references, and there are so many layers of allusions to all sorts of other literature and other historical events and concepts that some would be familiar with and some not. And there's this temptation to try to grasp all of those references, and that you don't fully get the book until you grasp all of them. What I would say to that is, unless it really, really matters to you to be a completionist about a single book, if there's some kind of additional value in completing that book, then maybe question the notion of completing and knowing everything about a work at all. Maybe question that very idea. Maybe it's a bad goal to actually have. For me, I'm always thinking about what matters about what it is that I'm reading. And if what I'm getting out of this book doesn't directly benefit my own curiosity, then I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me to just be an expert on something for its own sake. I don't want to show off expertise to anyone else. I just want to fulfill my curiosity. And so I'm always thinking about, what do I care most about? And if I don't care, then I'm not going to let that bother me. I'm just going to keep gliding over. And for me, very often, it's the beauty in text. Very often, it's the cleverness. It's the ways in which ideas can cascade in such a way to kind of build up a whole new way of seeing things. It's that reframing of the world that I value so much in literature. And so when an author is just going into minutia for minutia's sake, and it doesn't appeal to that aspect of who I am, then I don't need to have that be of utmost importance to me. I can allow myself to not need to know everything that I'm reading. And so that's another piece of advice when it comes to reading difficult literature, is allow yourself to just flow with the text for a while. So long as you can comprehend the basic elements of what's being stated, then maybe you can be discerning about what matters most to you, and you don't need to have everything matter equally in a complicated book. And that might at least get you to read it the first time through. And maybe what you'll discover when you reach the end is then you want to go back, and those layers of meaning that you missed the first time now have context on the basis of seeing the completed jigsaw puzzle. So then you can go back and slot in those pieces that you would otherwise miss. Things do not have to occur in order, and your understanding does not have to build in a linear fashion. Allow non-linearity, allow openness, and allow ambiguity especially. Ambiguity is a really tough thing for a lot of people. I think there's so much about text in particular that feels very concrete and set in stone. And so there's this idea of, oh, if I read something, I'll have all of these answers. And it's through the answers that arise some new self that's going to be worth venturing out into the world with. And I think sometimes it's really important to remember how much cannot be certain in life and how much cannot be grounded emotionally. There are certain things that aren't stilted by definition. There are certain things that require a relationship with other things and must be in the process in order to be understood. And if you get so fixated on stiffening something out and flattening it into some kind of concrete meaning, you can sometimes miss the openness of ambiguity, the ways that not having an answer to something and not having something set in stone and set down and known actually allows a gap for you to slot yourself into. You can have a much deeper relationship with something when it's more open-ended, when you allow the question to linger for a while. And sometimes with reading difficult books, they're not trying to give you answers. What they're trying to do is give you broader, more complex questions, questions that perhaps go in the face of whatever current dogma of the day there is. And it's merely the asking of the question that is the point, not getting answers. And sometimes when reading difficult books, perhaps the assumption is that there must be an answer. There must be something very concrete that I can latch onto. And maybe that is the false assumption that's starting out when it comes to reading difficult books. And that is the one that must be abandoned at some point. So I think if you're trying to read difficult books and you're having a hard time, maybe you're trying to have everything be too segmented, too organized, too left hemisphered, and you have to kind of embrace the openness of just discovery and allowing something to remain ambiguous all the way through. And then maybe you can slot things in later. But most of all, you should be getting value just for yourself as you're reading. It should be the process of reading that matters to you, not just the end point. Okay, the next question is, what role do note-taking and annotation play in your reading process? I think annotation is vital to attention while reading. I actually made a video on this already called My Evolution in Annotating Books, and that one goes into much more detail with examples of how I annotate. But I think the main key to annotation while I'm reading is I'm trying as best as I can to map out the territory of what I'm reading in such a way that I can rely on that map when I go back to the book later. My expectation is these books are going to be things, especially if they're books that I'm choosing on the basis of how much they matter to me. These are going to be books that I'm going to be going back to throughout my whole lifetime. And so the hope is that as I'm annotating, I'm anticipating that future self, the future me who's going to go back and grab the book off the shelf. And that future self is going to want to have some kind of legend, some kind of pointers to what had mattered before in what I was reading. And it becomes like markers of my journey, little breadcrumbs, so that I can go back through that same trail and find my way home. One key to that is, and this goes back to the advice that I gave before, is as I'm annotating, I'm thinking about the structure of what it is that I'm reading. Very often, this especially applies to nonfiction books, the author is trying to organize their information by subtopics and trying to build up the logic of those subtopics one step to the next. At least a good nonfiction author is keeping that in mind. And so I try to retrofit or recreate what those steps might have been, and I'm always categorizing the information on the edge of what I'm reading. Anytime I read a section of a nonfiction book, or even just a paragraph or two, I'm thinking to myself, okay, what was the main subject of that? What are the key terms within that? What are the broad points being made? And I categorize that information with different kinds of shapes, or for instance, I will circle main topics, I will put squares around vocabulary, I will put stars next to information that seems especially vital to come back to later. I will highlight certain sections. I will mark down with a line sections that are worth reading wholesale, or at least relate to the bigger topic or summarize the bigger topic that I had circled prior. I'm writing down a summation of the topic in just a couple of words in the margins. And the idea is I can then just open the book, I can look at those sets of descriptions in the margins, and if I cannot remember immediately what that was about, then I should go back and reread it. It becomes like almost a flashcard set for myself, but within the book itself. So every time I open it, if I can't get what's in those margins, if it doesn't immediately come to mind, then I don't understand it well enough. That becomes my way of turning every book that I read into a kind of study guide of itself. And that has been deeply useful for me with annotation. And one of the biggest benefits on top of that, on top of just turning your book into a kind of study guide is writing and annotating the book and really actively thinking about the organization of the book as you're reading it just makes it so much easier to stay attentive to it the whole way through, and makes it way, way easier to avoid that faulty moment of reading a bunch of text and then realizing at the last second, wait a minute, I don't actually understand what I just read. When you're constantly annotating and writing in your book, you're always thinking about what is the point? What am I reading about? And you're asking yourself questions along the road of that reading journey. The next question is, how do you balance reading for pleasure with reading for personal or professional development? Well, I think the driving force for all of my reading is, in essence, curiosity. And so, in that sense, I think all of my reading is personal. If I think about trying to read for professional development, I think about the limits of memorization without passion. So much of what makes something memorable for us is there's some kind of vitality to what it is that we're processing, and that's why it sticks in our memory. And if I was only reading in order to gain some kind of professional insight, I don't think I would be interested enough to actually remember it. And that's just me being honest with myself. I think I'm in a lucky position where everything I do professionally directly relates to my strongest passions. And I'm not in the position of needing to remember something that is strictly for some kind of financial gain. And I don't know that I care enough about that way of being to actually be able to memorize that kind of material. I imagine myself competing with someone who actually actively cared about that subject and was also reading the same books. And then I compare that to myself trying to professionally develop by reading that material. And I don't think that I could outcompete someone who genuinely had a passion for it. And so I make choices in my life to have everything that fits within my professional development needs to directly line up with what I'm most passionate about, because then I think that's the only way that I can properly compete within that field, is to actually care. Because caring about something and putting the work in, I think, is always going to have an advantage over someone who only puts the work in. That's what I think in terms of professional development. The other thing that comes to mind when I think about, well, how do I balance personal development? How do I balance the motivation behind reading? Is I try to remember how significant it is to just read and what that feels like to read with deep, deep care. From my point of view, finding that moment of utter attachment to a written work feels so much like the realest moment of my life. It's one of those moments where it is so precious in comparison to other forms of attention that I could give. And it feels so distinctive and so relevant to what it is to be a thoughtful human being that I, in many ways, cherish reading so much that it feels like, as an act in and of itself, it is valuable. Even if I end up reading a book and it's not the greatest thing and I don't get too much out of it, what I got out of it is not the end goal. What I got out of it is the process. And it's just merely the act of reading that feels to me of worth. And you might disagree with that. That's fine. Like, I think there's something kind of poetic about that maybe doesn't register for people as particularly significant. But I think that feeling is, to me, my addiction. That feeling of devotion to something quiet and personal and so deeply contextual as layers of language. And I just want to experience that as much as I can. And to me, that is my personal development. I don't read books for the sake of having read the books. I read books for the sake of the ideas in them. And that's what matters. So that answer seems to relate to the very next question here. And that is, what is the importance of setting reading goals? Now, I'm going to be honest, when I first saw this question, and by the way, all of these questions were created by Prose and Petticoats. So that's why I'm kind of reacting as if I had nothing to do with them, because I really, she came up with the ideas. But when I think about this question, I initially honestly kind of balked at it. I sort of distanced myself. What do you mean reading goals? Reading goals makes it sound so much like I'm turning it into a job, and I really, really hate the idea of turning reading into something obligatory like that. But if I'm honest with myself, I do end up tacitly creating goals. And I think one of those goals that I have been sticking to for probably about 10 years is I try to make sure that I read at least 1 to 3 hours every day, no matter what's going on, no matter how much work I have that day, no matter how tired I am. The easiest part of that is because I read first thing in the morning, that does allow that first hour of the day to be devoted to reading, and that kind of knocks it out pretty easily. But there are some days where I'm exceedingly busy and I have this goal of reading that amount of time. So what ends up happening when I'm very, very busy is I just make reading something that I can pick up from time to time. It doesn't need to always be these extended sessions. Sometimes it's just nice to have a book with you and just read a little bit at a time. And it's okay if it's only going to be 10 or 15 minutes at a time that you're reading. It's so much better than going on my phone, right? Or just watching a YouTube video. YouTube videos are great when you're eating, but outside of that, every chance that I get, I'll just read a little bit. And I actually find that the more I get used to just reading in little chunks at a time on those especially busy days, the easier it becomes to get into that right headspace to read. One of the challenges with reading in tiny chunks is that level of concentration isn't immediate, right? You start reading and then it's like, oh, I'm kind of not in the mood, or I'm not in the zone for reading. But since I've had such a consistent requirement of myself to just read even on the busiest days, it feels like it's become so much easier to get into that headspace of concentration. I like that. I like that feeling of I can just read a little bit of a book at a time when I'm just waiting for something, and I can just get quickly into that concentrated headspace, and I don't have to worry too much. And then, of course, when I have a much better day, days where I'm not obligated to do all of these other things, well, then I can just sit and read for hours and hours and hours at a time. And the more you do that, the easier that becomes, right? It just becomes easier to stay in quiet for a long time. And that's something that you just have to practice. And I don't think there's a shortcut to that. I really think it's just, you just have to do it every single day, unless you really just don't want to read. I mean, that's fine. You don't have to take reading that seriously. You could just do other things. But if you really, really want to be a reader and you think there's something of deep enough value in reading, then I think it's worth just forcing yourself bodily to just sit there and concentrate and read. And if you have to do it in little chunks, do it in little chunks. If you have to extend it across hours in a day, then do it that way. But I do think my reading goal is to at least read 1 hour every day, very often 3 hours, and sometimes a lot more. The best days are the days where I actually just really get to read all day long. So that's one example of my own reading goals. Another kind of loose reading goal that I have is to always be devoted to my curiosity, not to the pressures of what other people want me to read or what other people would expect. I think it's very tempting to read in order to be smart, or to read in order to show off that, oh, look, I read this and this and this. I feel that temptation. I'm just like everyone else. I'm insecure, just like everybody else. And I have this deep desire to be impressive to people. And I have this desire to, oh, look, like I'm no fool. You know, I went out of my way. Look, I read this hard book and look how cool I am. I know that feeling, and I obviously have that temptation. And I'm sure people would accuse me of doing that because I like to make videos about hard books. But my genuine goal is to not let that egoistic temptation to read things in order to show off get in the way of my actual life of reading. And the purpose of my life in reading is to fulfill my curiosity. And so I'm always asking myself, what do you really care about? Really, really, what do you care about? What matters to you? I try not to just focus on the utilitarian outcome of what it is that I read. I try not just to focus on, oh, look, wouldn't it be cool if I could talk about this? I think, what if I was just in isolation? If I was completely removed from everyone else, what would I care about reading? And that is part of my reading goals, is to make sure that I'm always reading what I care about most, and I'm not letting myself fall into the kind of pressure, the social pressure of needing to have something to deliver all the time. it's risky to try to deliver constantly, because then you're not really fulfilling your own goals. It's really just becoming about someone else's, often a stranger who has nothing to do with you, who's never going to live your life and never going to live in your thoughts. And it's important to me that since I am in my own head, that I make sure that what I put into my brain is something that I want to be there and that I want to be in conversation with forever, constantly. The last question is, what are some strategies for overcoming reading slumps or lack of motivation? I actually made a video about this fairly recently called Reading Without Purpose, or Reading is Not a Job, whatever the title is right now. That video was pointing to the ways that sometimes we can turn reading, because reading is delivering us information and information is so often practical, we can turn reading into a purely practical activity. It's one of those activities of a means to an end as opposed to an end in itself. And part of the purpose of that video is to remember that books can be ends in themselves, and there is value in reading for its own sake if you're choosing what you read based on personal preference and not just some kind of outside pressure. That video was kind of a meditation on that subject. But the other thing that I often think about when it comes to lacking motivation to read is to take seriously the weight of the fact that I'm going to die and I don't know when that's going to happen. I do think it's important to remember that I could very well have less time than I imagine. And knowing that that's the case makes the choices of what I read so valuable, because it could be the only books I ever get to. And the reason that's so useful to think about is because sometimes we amass a whole collection of books and we think, oh man, I can't wait to get to that someday, and that one someday, and that one someday. And there's this whole like someday segmentation of what it is that we're going to read. Oh, that one will happen eventually. And it's almost like automatic. Like, oh, it's just, I'll get around to it. I've tried to actively think to myself, what if I never get around to it? What would I lose? If that thought leads to me thinking carefully about a deep loss, like there's something in this book that seems so meaningful for me to understand, and for me to never get to it seems like I'm losing something precious, then it immediately makes me care and feel deep self-motivation to get to that book. And I try to have every book that I'm reading be born of that impetus, that drive on the basis of not wanting to have my life end before I got to read it. It subtracts out a lot of books that end up really essentially a total waste of time. And it makes it so that you prioritize your own time for yourself. You may not look it, because I know I have a lot of books, but I actually sell books quite often that I own, because I'm always questioning, wait, do I really, really want to read this? My goal is to have everything that I own be read. If I own a book and I don't genuinely feel excited about reading it, I get rid of it. I think that's important to curate your library in that sense, to make it so that the books can motivate you just by existing, just by being around you, by being deeply tempting in themselves. And maybe that's a counteraction to the temptation of the distractions of day-to-day life, is just to curate your library to the point that it perfectly mirrors your desires, such that that becomes the drive for you to continue reading. And maybe that's what's necessary for motivation. Since taking seriously that idea of maybe I'll never have time to get to that big checklist of things I want to get to, that has made it so that reading is always motivating for me. It's something I want to do every day. And again, it's in comparison to all the other things I can do and the ways that so many other forms of leisure are just not as satisfying as reading a great book. And so I try to read great books, and that is my motivation. Okay, well, I ended up talking about this subject for quite a long time, and I'll have to edit this video down. I hope it's not going to end up as long as it was to record this. It was over an hour of me just talking to myself. But if you're interested in covering this subject, I want to open this Read Smart tag to everyone. Me and Prose and Petticoats are doing this video together, and it's fantastic that we're doing that so we can have like a balanced perspective on our advice. But I would love to hear more booktubers and what they've learned from reading. We all have such different experiences when it comes to reading, and such different goals in mind, and so many different aspects of reading that matter to us. And we can learn a lot by just talking about what we love about reading books and what we've learned in that process. So I'd like to invite quite a few booktubers to do this tag. The first one is, of course, the deepest reader I know of, and that's Steve Donahue. I would love it if he did this tag. And then I would like to tag Aaron Facer and David Novak reads poetry. I know that he's kind of distancing himself from his channel in order to embrace other facets of life, and that's fantastic. But if he wants to come back and do a little tag, I would love it if David Novak reads poetry did this tag. I want to tag Paradise Reading, who's going through many classics herself, and I would love to hear her thoughts on what motivates her to do all of that. I would love to tag Active Mind, who's a really sophisticated new reader, someone who has only really been taking reading seriously in the last couple of years, but man, does he do so well and so quickly in that regard. And I would love to hear his thoughts on what he's learned about reading. And then, of course, the Grim Reader, who is a teacher herself, and I think she probably would have a lot of really unique things to say about how to read well. And she pushes herself to read challenging literature. She would have a lot of unique advice in that regard. But for you, the viewer, I recommend checking out Prose and Petticoats' version of this Read Smart tag. Her attempt to answer these same questions. I would bet that she would deal with it in a far cleaner way than I have, with a higher quality video overall. She's generally fantastic. So check out her video when you get a chance. Don't just watch my other ones, watch hers. I'll see you around. Thanks for watching.